Hey there, listeners. Ready for another deep dive? This time, we're tackling a topic that's close to a lot of our hearts.
Oh, yeah?
Animal welfare.
It's a big one.
It is. Specifically, we're looking at the records of two very prominent figures, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. You guys wanted to know more about their stances on all things animal-related, and honestly, getting into it, I was kind of surprised by some of what we uncovered.
Yeah, it's not always straightforward, is it?
Not at all. We dug through articles, public statements, you name it. And get ready for some unexpected twists, because it's not as simple as just saying pro-animal or anti-animal when it comes to these two.
Definitely not. You really have to look at the whole picture. Their actions, their policies, the context of everything. It's more complicated than just liking dogs, you know?
Right. Okay, so let's start with Kamala Harris. I mean, everyone's seen those adorable pictures of her with her beagle, Charlie, all over social media. It's refreshing to see a politician who's such a genuine dog lover, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And it's great that she's so open about it. But it goes beyond just cute photos, right? Her record shows she's been a consistent advocate for animals throughout her career.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the big things that stands out is her co-sponsorship of the Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture Act.
Huge moment for animal welfare.
It was. Can you remind us what made that act so important?
Well, for the first time, it made deliberate acts of animal cruelty a federal felony.
Yeah.
Which, before that, it wasn't.
Crazy to think about.
It is, yeah. And getting that kind of bipartisan support, Democrats and Republicans actually agreeing on something that's huge in politics, especially when it comes to animal welfare. It's not always an easy area to find common ground.
No, it's definitely not. So that was a big win. And she hasn't stopped there. Harris has also taken a strong stance against animal testing for cosmetics and has spoken out about improving conditions for farm animals. So it's not just about protecting pets, it's a broader vision,
Absolutely. It suggests a real concern for animal well-being across the board.
Yeah. You can really see how her personal love for animals seems to connect to her actions in the political arena.
Definitely. It's like she's walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And her work goes even further than that.
Oh, yeah.
Her commitment to environmental issues is another key piece of the puzzle here.
I see where you're going with this.
Right, because it all ties together.
It does.
How so?
Well, think about the bigger picture. Protecting endangered species, working to preserve biodiversity. These are all things that ultimately impact animals on a huge scale.
Right, it's not just about individual animals at that point. It's about protecting entire ecosystems.
Exactly. It suggests a more interconnected view of animal welfare, recognizing that it's not just about individual animals, but also about the health of the whole ecosystem.
It's like that saying,
Yeah.
everything's connected.
Exactly. And that's really important when it comes to something as complex as animal welfare.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've got Kamala Harris, the dog-loving, legislation-championing senator. Now let's shift gears and talk about Donald Trump. And get this, he was the first president in over a century without a White House pet.
Whoa. Really? I didn't realize it had been that long.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty unusual when you think about it, considering how much Americans love seeing pets in the White House.
Oh, totally. It's become a bit of a tradition, hasn't
It
it?
has, so that was definitely a break from the norm.
I know, right? It's like every president has had a dog or a cat, at least, going back as far as I can remember. So what was Trump's reasoning? Was he just not an animal person?
Well, his official explanation was that it wasn't practical given his lifestyle. So it's not necessarily that he disliked animals, it's more about practicality.
Okay, so not a cat person, got it.
Right. But to really understand his stance on animal welfare, we need to look at his actions, his policy decisions, which were often driven by a desire to balance economic interests with conservation efforts. Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme when you look at his presidency as a whole. Okay, so let's talk about those policies. One that really sparked debate was his rollback of parts of the Endangered Species Act.
Right, that was a big one. A lot of people were really concerned about that.
For sure. Can you give us a quick refresher on what that act is all about?
Of course. The Endangered Species Act is a really important piece of legislation designed to, protect species that are at risk of extinction.
Makes sense.
But the Trump administration argued that some of its regulations were too restrictive and hampered economic growth.
So basically, it became a tug-of-war between protecting animals and promoting business interests.
Exactly. And that's a tension that often comes up when we're talking about animal welfare. Some people argue that economic development should be the priority, while others believe that protecting vulnerable species should be paramount.
It's tough because there are valid points on both sides.
Yeah, it's one of those issues where there's no easy answer.
So where do you think those changes to the Endangered Species Act landed on the spectrum of animal friendliness?
It really depends on who you ask. Some people saw it as a step backward for animal protection, while others argued that it was necessary to streamline regulations and boost certain industries.
So a mixed bag, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. To fully understand the impact, you'd have to look at the specific provisions that were changed
Yeah.
and analyze their effects on individual species and their habitats.
Right, it's not a simple black and white issue.
Not at all.
So besides the Endangered Species Act, what were some of the other key policy decisions that impacted animals during the Trump administration?
Another significant one was the expansion of hunting and fishing on federal lands.
Okay, so that was popular with hunting and fishing groups, obviously.
Absolutely. They saw it as an opportunity to increase recreational access. But of course, it was met with criticism from animal welfare advocates, who were concerned about the potential for overhunting and habitat disruption.
Right, so again, you have that tension between different interests.
Exactly. And it's important to acknowledge both sides of the argument.
For sure. So it sounds like a lot of his decisions had both positive and negative consequences for animals, depending on your perspective.
That's a fair assessment, I think.
Yep.
And it's worth pointing out that he also signed into law the same Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture Act that Harris supported.
Oh, right. So that was a point of agreement between them.
It was making animal cruelty a federal felony.
Yeah.
That was a big step forward.
Definitely.
He also signed the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation, Management, and Recreation Act,
That's right.
which was huge. It was a huge win for conservationists. This act permanently reauthorized the Land and Water Conservation Fund and protected over 1 million acres of public land, including a lot of critical wildlife habitats.
Wow, that's significant.
It is. So his record is definitely a mix of actions that both helped and potentially harmed animal populations.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It's interesting how Trump's impact on animals seems to be mostly on a larger, more habitat-focused scale, unlike Harris's more personal legislative approach.
You're right. That is interesting. It highlights how different approaches to leadership can result in very different impacts on animal welfare.
Yeah, it's like they're coming at it from two totally different angles.
They are. While Harris seems to be driven by a sense of care and protection for individual animals, Trump's actions were more often shaped by broader policy considerations and a focus on land use management.
Which, again, both have their pros and cons.
Absolutely. And it's not about saying one approach is right and the other is wrong. It's about understanding the nuances and the potential consequences of each.
Right, because ultimately we want what's best for the animals, however we get there.
Exactly. And that requires a nuanced understanding of the issues at play.
Okay, so we've laid out some of the key points of each of their records. Now it's time to get down to the big question.
The big question. Which approach seems more animal-friendly to someone like you who cares about animal welfare? It's tricky, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's like they represent two totally different ways of thinking about it. On one hand, you've got Harris, who embodies that classic idea of animal friendliness, loves dogs, advocates for their care, pushes for laws to protect them.
Right, it's very much a focus on individual animals and their well-being.
Exactly. Then you have Trump, whose impact is felt much more broadly. His actions weren't specifically about being nice to pets, but his decisions on things like land use and development had huge ripple effects on entire animal populations.
And that's where things get really interesting. It forces us to think about animal friendliness on a much larger scale. Is it more about protecting individual animals from harm, like Harris's focus? Or is it about managing entire ecosystems and habitats, which is more in line with Trump's approach?
It's kind of like, is it better to build a fence around a single tree to protect it? Or is it better to manage the entire forest to ensure all the trees can thrive?
That's a great analogy. It really highlights the challenge of defining what animal friendliness truly means in the context of leadership and policy. There's no simple answer, and both approaches have the potential for both positive and negative outcomes.
Right, so much to consider. Okay, so before we get too lost in the philosophical side of things, let's bring it back to something a little more concrete. You mentioned earlier that Trump signed the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation, Management, and Recreation Act. Can you break that down for us a bit? What exactly did that act do, and why was it so important for conservation?
Sure. This act was a landmark achievement for conservation efforts. First of all, it permanently reauthorized the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is a vital program that uses revenues from offshore oil and gas drilling to fund conservation projects across the country.
So it's taking money from activities that can sometimes be harmful to the environment. and using it to protect and restore natural areas.
Exactly. It's like a built-in way to offset some of the negative impacts of resource extraction. And the Dingle Act didn't stop there. It also designated over 1.3 million acres of new wilderness areas, wild and scenic rivers, and national monuments, protecting these lands from development and preserving them for future generations.
Wow, that's a lot of protected land. What kind of impact does that have on animals specifically?
Huge impact. These protected areas provide critical habitat for countless species, from endangered plants and animals to iconic wildlife like grizzly bears, bald eagles, and wolves. By safeguarding these lands, the Act helps ensure that these animals have the space they need to survive and thrive. It's like creating massive nature reserves where wildlife can flourish without the threat of human encroachment.
So in a way, Trump's signing of this act was a massive win for animal welfare, even if it wasn't directly focused on individual animal care like some of Harris's actions.
Yeah.
It's all about perspective, right?
Absolutely. And it highlights how actions taken for a variety of reasons, in this case, conservation and recreation, can have significant, positive ripple effects on animal populations. It's a good reminder that sometimes the best way to protect animals is to protect the places they call home.
And speaking of homes, remember how we mentioned that Trump was the first president in over a century to not have a White House pet? Well, it turns out there's a long and fascinating history of presidential pets.
Oh, yeah. Presidential pets have always captured the public's imagination. They offer a glimpse into the personal lives of these powerful figures and often become beloved symbols of the presidency.
Makes you wonder if having a pet in the White House might actually influence a president's views on animal welfare. Is it possible that having that daily interaction with a furry friend could make them more sensitive to the needs of animals in general?
It's certainly plausible. Having a close relationship with an animal could foster a deeper sense of empathy and understanding for the animal world. And that, in turn, could potentially translate into more animal-friendly policies. But it's hard to say for sure. There are probably lots of factors at play, like personal values, political agendas, and the influence of advisors and lobbyists.
Right, it's probably never that simple. But it's still a fun idea to consider. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about specific actions and policies, the different approaches of these two figures, and even the potential impact of presidential pets. I think it's safe to say that both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have left their mark on the world of animal welfare, albeit in very different ways.
I completely agree. Their records highlight the complex interplay between personal values, political realities, and the various ways in which humans can impact the lives of animals. It's not about labeling one right or wrong, but rather understanding the nuances of their actions and the broader context in which they occurred.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how much influence a president can have on this issue. It's not something you hear about every day, but their decisions can have ripple effects that are felt throughout the animal kingdom.
Absolutely. And it raises the question of how much weight we should give to a leader's personal feelings about animals.
Right.
When evaluating their overall record on animal welfare, is it enough for them to simply love dogs? Or do we need to see that translated into concrete actions and policies that benefit a wider range of species?
That's a great point. It's a question worth pondering for sure. And it's something for our listeners to consider as well. This deep dive is just a starting point. There's a whole world of information out there about the intersection of politics and animal welfare, waiting to be explored.
It is, yeah.
So we've just scratched the surface here,
Yep.
but hopefully given you, our listeners, a solid foundation to,
To build on.
yeah, exactly. Like we always say, informed citizens are crucial to,
Yeah.
to shaping a better future for both people and animals, for sure. So keep digging, keep asking questions, and form your own conclusions.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And hey, maybe you'll even be inspired to do your own dump dive into this topic,
Yeah.
There are so many fascinating rabbit holes to explore when it comes to the intersection of politics and animal welfare.
It's true. It's a topic that often gets overlooked, but it's so important. After all, animals can't vote or lobby for themselves, so
Yeah.
it's up to us to make sure their interests are represented.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up, I have one final, slightly provocative question for you to chew
Yes.
on, if you had to choose. Whose approach to animal welfare do you think is ultimately more effective? Someone like Kamala Harris, who advocates for care and protection, or someone like Donald Trump, whose actions often had unintended consequences for animal populations? No right or wrong answer here, just food for thought.
That is a really good question. It really makes you think about, what does it really mean to be animal friendly? Is it about individual compassion and legislative action? Or is it about that broader ecological impact, even if those impacts aren't always, you know, predictable.
Right.
It's tough. There's no easy answer.
Definitely not. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful, maybe even a little surprising. It certainly gave me a whole new perspective on how our leaders can impact the lives of animals, both directly and indirectly.
It really makes you realize how much power they have
Mm.
and how important it is to hold them accountable.
For sure. So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning. Until next time.